up relatively infrequently. And so probably because we don't do them all the time, we get a little bit nervous when we need to do them. So what we thought we'd do first of all is just sort of set the scene, just giving you some examples of the types of conversations that you might have had, but also others. First of all, we've got, I think there's the obvious ones that would come up relatively frequently for most people in a managerial or an HR type role. So poor or inconsistent performance, potential redundancy type situations, and then sickness, particularly ad hoc sicknesses, those sicknesses that perhaps raise some questions about in the nature of their pattern. So always on a Friday, or might have been on a day when somebody had requested holiday that had been refused. But those, I think, are part and parcel of the types of things that as managing employees and being responsible for perhaps HR particularly, you'd be quite comfortable doing or quite frequent doing within a particular framework because they operate within a framework. So what we also wanted to do is try and get a little bit more creative about the sorts of difficult conversations people have had, because they're often the trickier ones to deal with. So personal hygiene came up as quite a biggie. I remember my mum having to do a conversation about somebody that people in the staff had complained about somebody having body odour, and it caused, years ago now, caused her immense difficulty. How on earth does one raise that? Because clearly somebody's complained about, so people have spotted it. That's a tricky one. It can have underlying medical conditions. It can be, it goes right to the heart of somebody's identity. So that's one that we certainly heard coming up. I actually had one with a client, which was to do with smelling of alcohol, somebody coming back smelling of alcohol at lunch, after lunch. Back in the day, it was quite common for us to go for lunch on a Friday afternoon and have a glass of wine or whatever. And so that was the case. But in this particular case, they were all operating machinery. And coming back after, as it happens, when it was investigated further, again, it was to do with medical. Apparently, they were taking some medicine that's not unhelpful, but it wasn't. But so again, that can be one. Then we've got one, I think it's come to the forefront really quite recently, is inappropriate clothing or work attire. I think that's quite a biggie. We've all been perhaps a little bit more flexible. I think style has changed. I think the days of men wearing double-breasted suits and waistcoats and ties is possibly long gone for many, and also different sectors have different approaches as well. So what is appropriate clothing? Sometimes you may have a clothing policy, although I think they slightly go out of date, and I don't think we do anymore that you have to wear women have to wear heels or anything like that. But a suitable clothing, and again, that's quite subjective. It's to do with somebody's personal choice, what they wear, and also, funny enough, clothes can look different on different people as well. So I think that's quite a tricky one as well, and particularly with lockdown and people having worked from home, perhaps become more flexible in their style or used to not going into the office. So I think that's quite a biggie one. Snappy, rude people or office banter. When does banter become potentially discriminatory? All sorts of things. We're people. We talk to each other. But at what point does perhaps that banter cross a line where it is inappropriate? Again, it's about people's personal styles. It's another one we've come across. Use of social media, either through the workplace or outside the workplace. Diversity and inclusion, I think it's quite a biggie. We were talking about this in our prepping meeting, actually, about introducing diversity and inclusion, and how you get that concept across can be quite a tricky one. Finally, the other one we came up with, that'd be really interesting to hear other ones that people have come up with themselves, is perhaps blurred boundaries. So what I'm thinking about is, when people are perhaps messaging or texting, not friends that they work with, but perhaps, messaging people on their personal mobiles or WhatsApping. We've all become very used to different types of medium, even more so since the way we've been required to work more flexibly recently. Is that appropriate? Well, at one point, does perhaps actually, we don't want you messaging. I don't want you messaging me about a work thing at 12 o'clock at night on my personal phone. Thanks very much. And complaining about that. So the ones that are tricky are the ones that perhaps go outside the scope of a set work procedure and border more on perhaps people's personal situations or circumstances. So they're the ones I think that we're going to obviously give you some tools to how you might be able to deal with those. Just out of interest, again, we thought we'd just pop another poll in just to see whether what out of the topics that we've discussed have people had experience of dealing with, and if you've got any that were really interesting and how you manage them, then it'd be good to hear. So you can also include ones where you've perhaps been a recipient of it. hopefully the poll's going to come back to me in a bit. Ah, here we go. Challenging behaviour, poor performance. Yeah. Well, that's quite good, because hopefully we're actually going to deal with that right at the end. So that's quite a good one, hopefully. For now, I'm going to pass you over to Nikki, I think, about why we should be tackling these conversations. So having given you a bit of a flavour, we'll pass over to that now. Okay, Nikki.
Smashing, brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Becky. Yes, no, I'm sure, well, as you can see from the poll there, quite a few of you were able to relate to these difficult conversations. And obviously Becky's given us a snapshot as to examples, but I'm sure that in your own lives, as Becky says, whether in respect of dealing with other members of staff or perhaps in relation to yourself, these conversations may have been had. And it's always tricky, isn't it? Because they do cover a multitude of different situations, but just to give you a bit of a flavour there. I'm just going to briefly touch on why is it important to have these conversations, which are usually fairly difficult. I think the starting point is to recognise that we're humans, and humans usually prefer to avoid conflict, in my experience. There are these odd individuals that seem to quite enjoy conflict, but on the whole, most humans tend to prefer not to get into any form of conflict, or at least not intentionally, and they prefer not to address issues. In my experience, both as an employment lawyer and when I did a HR role, managers and colleagues in general tended to sort of try to, let's say, avoid the elephant in the room, if I can use that phrase. Issues would often be left to fester and not be addressed. Now, unfortunately, whether we like it or not, these sorts of conversations are part and parcel of life. And ultimately, the best way to actually manage a difficult conversation is to deal with the issue head on, deal with it at the outset. Where issues, excuse me, are left to fester, and I'm sure that some of you will be able to resonate with you, where issues are left to fester, they can often, and they often will become bigger issues. They don't tend to just go away. So why is it important to be dealing with the conversations? Well, it's important because if the conversations aren't dealt with, they are going to get worse, probably. More likely than not, they're going to get worse. They're going to become bigger issues. They're going to become bigger issues that probably didn't need to be such big issues if they'd have been dealt with at the very beginning. They are potentially damaging to working relationships between teams, colleagues, departments, offices. So these issues will manifest, they'll get bigger, and it will create a bigger issue within the workplace as well. That in itself can lead to separate disciplinary issues. It can lead to capability issues, which are going to have to be addressing. That as well incurs a huge amount of management time and potential cost to a business. Had you dealt with them at the outset, then they probably wouldn't have got to that point. It also, if issues aren't dealt with, it can lead to reduced staff morale. As you'll recognise, that in itself is also an issue, because potentially, again, it could lead to capability, performance management issues, again, potentially disability issues, lack of productivity. So again, if your staff morale is down, they're not going to be as productive. It can also be reduced confidence in the employer's ability to manage. So actually, from an employee's point of view, if the business don't seem to deal with issues, then their perception is, well, why bother? You know, what's the point in raising things? This is just how it is. And that can create a very toxic working environment. Once you have a toxic working environment, it can be incredibly hard to turn that around, because it effectively seems to suck everybody else into it. Again, higher absenteeism and turnover, that will involve greater management time, and again, cost to the business. Increased stress levels as well. So depending on what the situation is, people may become quite stressed with the situation, whether it be the perception that nothing's dealt with, or whether it be that somebody's got an issue that isn't being addressed. But nonetheless, that can lead to potential disability issues, because somebody may be increased stress levels could lead to a disability related issue. Perhaps it could manifest itself in depression. Also, bullying work environment, that can also be the result of issues not being dealt with. There's lots of excuses that we've heard over the time, which again, I'm going to guess that this is going to resonate with some of you. So excuses that I've heard for not dealing with the issues are things like, I don't have the time, it will work itself out. That's one that often comes up. Everyone makes mistakes. So if we've got somebody that's making constant mistakes, oh, well, everyone makes mistakes. Yes, but if it's constant, then maybe there's something more to it. Oh, we'll deal with it later. Somebody else will pick it up. Somebody else will deal with it, another manager. And actually these people can end up getting shifted around into different departments as well. Now, what does it do by having these conversations? It gives the business an opportunity to do a number of things, actually. Not only can it resolve the workplace conflicts quickly and efficiently, it can lead to increased performance and engagement amongst staff, improved relationships between colleagues and teams, increased productivity, improved staff morale. And I think really importantly, basically what it does is it's setting the tone of the business. It's showing that a business does actually deal with issues. It shows that you have values and that you're going to be adhering to those values. And it creates the foundation of an honest and open and non-toxic work environment. A bigger picture as well is staff retention. If staff are happy, then generally they're more likely to stick around, so you're not having to keep trying to be recruiting. In the current climate, it's quite difficult at the moment to potentially be recruiting staff. It can lead to higher retention rates of staff as well, which again reduce time and cost to the business. What it can also do is, if you're known to be a good employer, then actually people tend to want to work for you. So that in itself is also advantageous for the business. So in conclusion, people generally prefer not to deal with these conversations. They hope they're going to go away, but inevitably they're not going to go away. They do need to be addressed, ideally at the outset. Reasons that I've outlined above are why. Just makes for a better work environment. From a management and HR point of view, it gives you an easier life, actually, if you address the issues at the outset. It's also important to be recognising with the issues, are they going to be trivial or temporary issues, or are they something that's going to be longer term? So depending what the issue is and depending what the circumstances are, I know perhaps somebody's just lost their family, and actually that may very well therefore have an impact. They may not feel like getting dressed in the morning or having a daily shower or whatever it is. So that may be the background as to why that's arisen. But again, it is a case of looking at the individual circumstances and having a conversation. And I think it's just important just to make sure that you are approachable as well. It's a two-way process. So make sure that you are approachable. Don't be afraid to have a conversation with your staff. If you keep in touch with your staff, then you're going to know whether there's any background issues. You're going to know whether it's something which is actually going to become potentially a longer term issue, or whether it's just something that they're going through at this moment in time and may possibly sort itself out or resolve itself fairly quickly. But certainly by putting your head in the sand, that is not going to resolve anything at all, not in my experience anyway. Hopefully that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, to be honest, across that, but hopefully that gets across to you why there is a need to actually address these issues. Now, I suppose the next question is, how do you address them? And I'm going to pass you over to Katie to pick that one up.
Super, thank you, Nikki. Good morning, everybody. For those of you that don't know me, so my name's Katie Allen. I am a equity, diversity and inclusion specialist and consultant and coach. So I work with organisations to shape their EDI strategy and workplace culture, as well as with individuals on a one-to-one basis for coaching. So that's a bit of my background. So to talk about the how part of how are we going to have difficult conversations. So as with everything, the more that we do something, the easier it becomes. But let's be really clear here about difficult conversations, right? Nobody enjoys them, not one person I don't know. Just because you have conversations more and more frequently, no one's getting up in the morning getting really excited about going in to have one of these conversations. So naturally, as Nikki was talking about there, we do come up with avoidance tactics and excuses to maybe try and make ourselves feel better and distance ourselves from having to have this conversation. I mean, I myself in my HR career, I've had to have conversations ranging from redundancy consultations, absence management issues, performance management issues, all the way up to supporting employees who might be managing a terminal illness. So there is always a conversation that will feel emotional and difficult and something that we don't want to have to engage with. But it's all the more important as to why, as Nikki's just explained, why we do need to be doing these conversations. So what we can do is, whilst we may not get comfortable with them, we can come up with tools and tactics to really help us be more prepared, to build our own confidence, and to give us some focus for the conversation so that we can at least make the conversation as effective as possible. So just to begin, if we don't have an immediate and pressing issue that we need to deal with straight away, I would absolutely say the best course of action here is to begin to establish a culture of feedback in your organisations. Now, I know like feedback is the F word that everybody really dreads at work, and the thought of someone coming along and saying, oh, can I offer you some feedback, strikes fear basically into the heart of practically everybody. But for me, that's why it's really important to begin having those conversations, when they are just small, forward-looking growth conversations around feedback, because it helps us remove those barriers, as Nikki was talking about. The barriers that we all face around having feedback conversations generally come around confidence around what am I going to say, and confidence around how is the other person going to react. So the more that you can build that into your workplaces, within your culture, making the giving and receiving, so not only telling people about things that they can do to improve their future performance and things that they've done well, but also seeking that feedback, requesting the feedback from other people to help your own performance and your own future growth. That helps you build your culture of trust and confidence, and it really helps set future conversations off with positive intent. And for me, that's something that's really important, is always approaching conversations, whether they be around feedback or difficult conversations, with a positive intent, because that's going to help the receptive listening piece on the part of the recipient. For me, though, however, when we start talking about the differences between general feedback conversations and difficult conversations, there is a divergence. So like I said, with the feedback, it's future looking, and at least on the part of the recipient, when you offer feedback to somebody, it's completely up to them as to whether they want to accept that and do something with it, or accept it, say thanks very much, and ignore it. When it comes to a difficult conversation, it diverges, because with a difficult conversation, we are approaching somebody because we require a change. So we are having this conversation because we need there to be some sort of action, whether it's behavioural or situational. Something needs to be different as a result of it taking place. So what I want to share with you now are my 5 key areas for how to really go about and prepare yourself to have a difficult conversation so that it can be as effective as possible. Hockey docky. So the first one, it's all around setting your intention. And I say set your intention because really this is the main section that focuses specifically on you, because the rest of the sections really focus on the person you're having the conversation with. So this is where we get to be inward looking and set ourselves up for having a good conversation. What we need to be clear about is why. Why are we having this conversation? And if I use an example that we had in our poll at the beginning, I know that Becky's going to come on to talk about performance management. So if I take the next most popular one around challenging behaviour. So if we say we're a manager and in our team, we have got an individual who has become increasingly agitated. They're being a bit snarky and a bit snippy, and something's not quite right. So they wouldn't normally be like that, but we've noticed over the past weeks, something's creeping in. People around them in the team are starting to talk. Nobody really wants to approach them, and something's going on. So if we're going to set our intention for that conversation, okay, so why are we going to have that conversation with them? It's because they're becoming a bit of a pain, quite frankly. They're having an impact on the team around us. Their performance is dipping, and they're displaying behaviours that we don't want to be seeing in the workplace. So we've got to be really clear on our motivation. So we've got that. What do we need to change? as a result of having this conversation? Well, we need them to change their behaviour. We need there to be an output coming from that. So we need them to start thinking about the impact of their own behaviour, what might be causing it, and basically changing that, doing something differently when they come to work. We also need to think about, in preparing ourselves for this conversation, what don't we know? So we know what we do know. We know that they're coming to work in a way they wouldn't normally, and we know that they're upsetting people around them. But what don't we know? What questions have we got that we need answering from them? And these could be things like, what's going on in their life? What's causing this? Is there something happening at work that we need to investigate, that we need to get to the bottom of? You know, is there more to it than first meets the eye? So why are we having our conversation? What do we need to change? And what don't we know? What questions do we need to ask? And the way to really set your intention, and that's why I call this kind of setting our intention, it's around, that's quite a lot of information to hold in our heads when we're going into a conversation. And if we keep that in our heads, we're going to probably be focusing on trying to remember everything and getting it right. So I would say, write it down, write a script if you need to, or at best, write yourself some bullet points, and don't be afraid to take those along with you to this conversation and tick them off as you go, because knowing you've got something written down that you can refer to is going to leave your brain free for having the conversation and doing the listening piece that we're going to come on to shortly. So those are kind of the setting your own intention. And the final piece on that as well is to think about the environment that you're going to have that conversation in. So how and when are you going to have it? Because there's no point just wandering up to this person at their desk and just saying, hey, let's talk about your behaviour. That's probably not going to go down very well, and probably doing it in a space when there's other people around them, again, not going to be well received and likely to make them defensive. And likewise for yourself, for your own intention. If you've just put the phone down from having an uncomfortable conversation yourself with somebody else, sidling up to somebody else and try to go into another difficult conversation probably isn't going to work for you either. So it really is about grounding yourself and thinking, how am I going into this conversation so that I can be non-judgmental, that I can be curious and listen to the answers that I'm going to be given and really get the best out of that conversation. So hopefully that makes sense around setting your own intention. So that's the first piece. The next piece then is really all about the conversation. It's moving on to that individual. So we've got our bullet points, we know what we're going to say and why we're going to say it and what we need to change. We've got a good environment that we're sitting down in. So once we've shared that with the individual, the next thing we need to do is listen. So that's step 2. It's simply listen, but it's listen to understand. So as human beings, we're really, really great at listening to conversations, waiting to hear the stuff that we're expecting to hear, picking out the bits that fit our narrative, and maybe interrupting to ask questions because it's triggered something in our own thoughts. So what I'm saying here is listen to understand. Let them say everything they've got to say, because it's likely that this is going to have been the first opportunity they will have had to hear what you're saying. So you will have maybe rehearsed it, you would have written your bullet points, you'll be comfortable with what you're saying. This is brand new and fresh to them. So give them time to formulate what they want to say and give them time to respond and listen, no matter how frustrating it might be when you hear some of the thoughts that are coming out. It's really listening to what it is they've got to say and giving them the sense that they've been heard that is going to help you turn this into a more meaningful conversation. So if we take our challenging behaviour person as our example, if when we sit down and we start talking to them, we've noticed that there's been a change in your behaviour, these are the behaviours we're seeing and it's impacting your team. Can we have a conversation about that? What's going on in your life? Tell me about that. It could be actually that they've recently, as Nikki was saying, maybe they've recently lost a family member, or maybe they've had increased responsibilities at home in taking care of an elderly relative, or any myriad of things that could be going on that they're just not comfortable sharing when they come to work, and they've been internalizing it and it's coming out. And there could be so many reasons. So that's why the whole listening piece is really important, which then takes us on to our next point, which is about weighing our response. So like I said, when we're listening and we're listening to understand, it then gives us a couple of options. It's either to look back at when we prepared ourselves and set our intention and we thought, okay, this is the change I need to happen. But then we get to weigh our response and say, well, with the new information I've gathered now through listening, is that response still valid? Do I need to take the same steps? So we might have thought, your behavior needs to change, otherwise we're going to have, you know, a disciplinary conversation. Or it could be, now I understand that you've got other things going on. Do you need to have a conversation with occupational health? Can we get you some external support in looking after your elderly relative? How do we need to take it forward? Are there other options available to us? So that's what I mean by weigh your response. Has anything changed as a result of the information you've been given? Okay, so we're setting our intention ourselves. We're listening to the individual and what they've got to say, and we're considering how we want to respond to that and being flexible and open with that. The fourth point then is about summarising. So we'll have had our conversation, we'll have learnt some information and decided what we need to do going forward. That is going to include having conversations with the individual about what you need to see change. So what needs to be different, because there is a reason you had this conversation, so something has to change. And it could well be that they need to go and seek some support from their family members or from occupational health. So summarise that back to them, summarise how you have understood the conversation. Because again, as human beings, when we hear things, we run it through our own filter within our brain, which covers things of our own beliefs, our own values, our own assumptions. So double check back with the individual that what you're understanding is the same as what they're understanding, because that gives you that opportunity to iron out any miscommunications or kinks that might be in there ahead of going somewhere else. So you both know exactly where you stand. What it also gives you is the opportunity to talk about accountability, because you're holding them accountable by giving them the actions, summarising them back to them. And if you're booking anything in for the future, for example, for future meetings, you're also setting your expectations in terms of a timeline and when you need those changes to have taken place. So that's why summarising is really important in the conversation. And then the final point, just to build on the summarising in the conversation, is around documentation. Document that conversation. There is a reason you've had to have it in the first place. There's a reason that you went into this conversation. There's follow-up actions that might need to be agreed. So please do document those conversations, because you will need to refer back to them to make sure the actions have been followed up on, and you will potentially need to refer back to them if further meetings or further steps need to be taken. So, you know, definitely document those conversations. So those are my 5 steps of the how to have the conversation. So it's set your own intention, be clear about what you need to get out of the conversation and what you want to say so that you can focus on the conversation. Listen, weigh your response, summarise the conversation that took place and the actions that have come about as a result, and then document that thing. Okay, and then I guess my final point, just as an aside, is if you are a HR professional who is supporting a manager through one of these conversations, don't be afraid to rehearse maybe some difficult conversations with them ahead of it, because sometimes when we are the person leading that conversation, the first time we say those words, we can trip over them a little bit, and they might sound a bit weird coming out. So even when we've thought them through and we've run them, when they actually come out of our mouths, they feel really uncomfortable. So just saying them out loud to another person first can take some of that out. And again, it means that when we're setting our intention for the conversation, we arrive feeling much more confident about it, and removing those barriers that might exist as stopping us having the conversation. And it's also good, again, a good opportunity to have feedback conversation. You can give that manager some feedback on how they've done, maybe the language they used, anything they might want to think about doing differently. So that's it for me around the how piece. So I will pass to Becky to talk about performance management.
Thank you, Katie. That was really, really interesting, really informative. It certainly helped me think about how you can structure something. It gives you confidence even just approaching it. So thanks very much. That was really helpful. I'm just going to focus a little bit on performance management, and then later on to the protected conversations, because sometimes the two do sit together quite comfortably. I think a culture of trust, inclusion, regular feedback, I think is the key to not needing to do performance management, to be honest. I often come in as an employment lawyer at the end, where now they want to start a performance management process. I'm like, well, what have you done before? And often, sadly, it's ostrich. You're sticking the head in the sand, haven't dealt with it, haven't done anything before. My view is somebody should never go into even an appraisal or performance meeting and be surprised by the outcome. They should always know when they go in, that you should always know how you're doing on a regular basis. And if you have a culture of regular feedback, positive, supportive, where people need to improve, and actually guide your team or staff that you work with, then they will know if they're not performing. They'll also know where they're confident and are performing. And I think that's really important. It's how that sort of communication works. So, and that's a culture that's got to emerge. On top of that, you've got probably more of a regular performance management system that sort of sits alongside that. I think a lot of businesses move away from the annual performance management system. It's quite hard to manage somebody on an annual basis. So sort of more mini performance management processes where you regularly respond to how people are doing, how they can improve, what they might need to do. And again, focusing on the things that they're doing well as the things that they perhaps need some more support in place. And hopefully you've got this regular feedback culture and a 360-degree feedback. So actually the more senior people get, it doesn't necessarily mean they're doing that bit in the way that they should be doing necessarily. So proper regular feedback that actually becomes part of your everyday working life. And we all accept that. The reason people often get the back up a little bit about a performance, or we need to talk about your performance, is because nobody's told them before. They've not told them how they're doing. And suddenly it comes completely out of the blue that, oh my goodness, have I been doing this wrong all the time? I don't know what I'm doing. Whereas actually, if you're regularly, on a regular basis, saying, great, like the way you did that, that was fantastic. What I perhaps suggest you do next time is try this way, or try that bit this way, or another way you could have done that. Gives you something to build on, because perhaps if next time they don't do what you'd suggested, you can pick up and say, I noticed you didn't do what we talked about last time. Is there perhaps a reason why you didn't do that? I always go back to my first year as a trainee. I wrote my first long letter. It was in a family team, and it came back and it had red pen all over it, which was, I sat there thinking, oh, it's awful. What have I done wrong? I thought, I'm here to learn. I'm going to go to my principal. I'm going to say, look, I think I need to understand what I did wrong here. And he just said, oh, yeah, none of it's wrong. I just wouldn't have said it like that. And I thought, if they'd have just said to me, actually, do you know what, I've reworded it because I would have said it in a different thing, but actually the substance of what you've written is good, it'd have been fine. And actually but I had to do that proactive approach of actually asking them. If he'd taken, I mean, it was his job to be training me, if he'd taken the time to actually go through and say, look, I've changed it because actually I have a different style and it's going out in my name and therefore I'd like it in a different way. But actually what you've said is right. You can use my style if you want to. I think I would have felt so much more confident about receiving that feedback. We tend to get very defensive about feedback. I think everybody gets defensive. We throw around the term constructive criticism. I think everybody only ever hears the word criticism, but the more frequent we get constructive feedback or constructive criticism, I think the more open we are to it. So that's really going back to what Nikki says, is not burying your head. I saw what Katie was saying, not burying your head in the sand, really having a culture where feedback is part of everything that you do. And if you have that, I don't think normally you actually get to the point where you need to do something more formal. All that, I would say, is your informal capability processes. And the reason why we need to treat capability so seriously, I suppose, is not only is it fundamental to our business and the way that we operate, but it is also one of the ways that we may need to at some point look to dismiss an employee if ultimately their capability it doesn't fit and doesn't improve in the way that we want to. It is a fair reason for dismissing, and so those employees with over 2 years service, you can dismiss them for capability. You do have to follow a set process, but it can become a formal process with a very serious outcome, both for the individual concerned and also the business. So I think a culture of you really using that informal process. I regularly get clients come to me who haven't even explored the informal stuff, and so straight away want to jump to the formal process. What steps, how many meetings do I have to have? What do I have to do? I'm like, what have you done before? But often, because they haven't dealt with anything, the behaviours become normalised. Nobody's ever told me I'm doing anything wrong, therefore I'm just going to go ahead and do what I'm doing anyway. And I think that's actually what's quite important, is you're not helping people by not telling them where you need them to improve, because all they will do is continue to do the same thing again because they don't know that they're doing it wrong. So you might not do it because you don't want to do it and you might feel bad about doing it, but actually getting your mind to that actually you're not helping them by not telling them, because they can't improve what they don't know that you're not happy with. So my main thing actually is use that informal process, really use that informal process, build in a culture of feedback, build in a culture of openness, open, confidential trust culture. Moving to the formal process is, to be honest, relatively straightforward. You'll have to have those difficult conversations, but actually if you've been dealing with it, in a proactive informal basis, really you're just making a small minor tweak for, look, I'm sorry, the informal stuff isn't working now, unfortunately we're going to have to do this on a more formal footing. It is not a surprise. Whereas if actually nobody's ever told this person they're doing things wrong, or not the way that is expected, and then suddenly, right, we want a meeting, we're calling you to a meeting to talk about your capability. Again, people get their hackles up. Again, as part of that informal process, I think you'd also be very mindful of sudden changes in performance. So sudden changes, often it will come about if perhaps a new manager has taken over, and really its expectations are different. So it's being mindful of the expectations being different. Doesn't mean the person has always been doing everything wrong. It's a two-way process. It's my expectations or I'm looking for are perhaps slightly different. And complete changes could have much wider reasons for why their performance may have dipped. And so again, going back to what Katie was saying is talking to your staff. And if you've got that informal feedback process, you can include in that, look, things, you've always done this ever so, great, things seem to be slipping a bit. Is there a particular reason for that? The formal process, most employers will have a formal capability process. It normally involves a number of meetings. You'd certainly have a first meeting where you're telling them that, that unfortunately their performance isn't meeting the required standard. Then you'd be going on to putting in, you have a responsibility if you want to make that ultimate dismissal fair, you have a responsibility to support them to improve in that performance. So why are you not meeting those performance? What can we do to support you? What can we do to help you? And putting a plan in place whereby that support works alongside the expectations that you require for them to improve. And having a period of time to do that, I have to guess how long's a piece of string? How long do you think it will take for you to be able to assess how long it will take them to improve? And a lot of that will depend on the job. If it's a job that they turn everything around quick all the time, you can probably assess their improvement relatively quickly. You may also have to look alongside it with if there are other reasons as to why their employment performance might not have improved. So, looking at that as well, you may need a longer process if perhaps they are unwell or they have a family member or something that's unwell, and that's why the mind perhaps isn't quite on the job as normally it would be. What support can you put in place to be able to try and help them? Or perhaps you might need slightly longer till that resolves. So it's looking at how you support them to see whether they can improve to the standard that is expected of them. That is obviously particularly important for those employees with 2 years service, because if you unfairly dismiss them, you've got potential employment tribunal claim. But I would say it's good practice for everybody. I think it's good HR practice for all members of staff. And can feed in quite well to even your probationary policies, actually. Probationary policy is all part of the same thing. That's when people first start and they don't know what your expectations are. If ultimately at the end of your formal process, the employee still just hasn't improved to the levels that are required, then it's a dismissal on notice. So it's giving them notice of termination. Unfortunately, your employee, you haven't improved to the standard that we require. We've got no alternative but to dismiss you. They're entitled to be accompanied to that meeting, have somebody, a work-based colleague or a trade union rep with them there to support them. And dismissal is on notice, so either statutory notice or contractual notice, whichever is the greater. Sometimes get asked, do they have to work their notice? I think it's a bit weird one, actually. If you're getting rid of them because you're rubbish, why do you want them to work their notice period? You may feel like, let's say somebody's on 3 months notice, I've got to pay them for 3 months and they're not going to work for me for 3 months. No, but you're getting rid of them because you think they're rubbish. Why? It slightly sweetens the blow. You may want a period of handover. Also think what sort of engagement that employee is going to have in the work that they're doing while they're working out their notice period for the time that they're actually there. So I personally typically will always go unless there's a reason not to pay in lieu of notice rather than termination. It also, particularly with a longer notice period, gives that person a financial buffer for them to feel like they've got some time to get their confidence back and find another job. It is also possibly worth talking about how a reference might be dealt with, because they may be particularly insecure about applying for new jobs, worrying about what a reference would say if they've been dismissed for capability. Aside from that, sometimes what happens is people will see the writing on the wall and they'll resign. That is quite normal. I don't see many people that you can tell whether something's improving in the way that it should do. So one option is often once you start that process, somebody will actually resign. Another option, a way around, and sometimes this will quite often happen with it tends to happen quite often with capability, the protected conversation. So protected conversations were introduced in about 2013. They were seen as this big new thing. necessarily think they are a particularly new thing. We've always had the ability to be able to have without prejudice conversations, but for those you do need an existing sort of concern or issue ongoing. Let's say maybe you'd ever dealt with capability before, it was not an issue at the moment, would have come completely out of the blue for this individual, and nobody has no confidence, the employer has no confidence that this person will improve, no matter what we put in place. And it feels like going through that process is a waste of everybody's time. It's a waste of management time to do it. It's not going to be nice for everybody. The employer isn't going to improve no matter what we do. There is the possibility of using what's called a protected conversation. We were looking at, what do you call them? And it was section 111A. They were. It was a section inserted into the Employment Rights Act, and it's important you sort of state what that protected conversation is. You don't need to have an existing dispute for that, and it can pretty much come out of the blue. The reason they're important is it can save everybody a bit of pain. If you know what the writing rule is going to be, it stops you having to go through that process. But what you also have to be aware of is the commercial reality. While it can't be referred to, it is a protected conversation. It's like it didn't happen. Let's be honest, it did happen, and everybody knows it happened, and it's a commercial decision that you have to manage the commercial reality of, what if this person says, no, sorry, I'm not remotely interested in what you're offering me. What are you going to do? Because if they don't do that, either you're going to have to up your inducement an awful lot more to make them do that, or you're going to have to try and pretend like this didn't happen, which for any human being is quite hard to do. So thinking about what the outcome will be if the protected conversation doesn't go the way you want to. Just as an aside, you're not to have any improper behaviour, it's called, in relation to, otherwise that will sort of blow this veil of this protected conversation. So can't be any allegations of discrimination, any bullying, intimidation, or undue pressure. Something that's quite interesting with that, and the issue with discrimination is discrimination can be squeezed into an awful lot of different characteristics. So it's really being very clear. We are just talking about perhaps performance here using this example. Undue pressure is something that I do see coming up quite a bit, is actually somebody being given a very tight deadline in order to make a decision. You tell us by the end of tomorrow whether you want to do this, go home, tell us by the end of tomorrow if you want to do it. And that could be seen as intimidating behaviour or undue pressure, which could blow the screen of that protected conversation. There is an ACAS code. If you want to find out more about it, it's actually on settlement agreements, but it'll cover protected characteristics as well. Because the settlement agreement is the typical way that a protected conversation will go. Is you've got to give an inducement to this person to make them want to leave, and if they've got Employment Rights Act, I mean, at least they'll have their contractual notice, and if they've got over 2 years service, then they will also have unfair dismissal protection. And so you've got to offer them a financial. You don't want to be sending them away with the possibility that they'd sue you. So if you're going to do this, you're going to want to tie it all up with what you're going to be offering them in a settlement agreement, which is the only way that you can settle those statutory claims that an employee has. So, so that code of practice is quite useful. Settlement agreements, and perhaps years ago, had a bit of a negative press. I think these days I see them in so many different scenarios that they certainly don't have negative connotations these days. And I think any employer who is offering anything over and above what they need to, or doing anything in a slightly unusual way, would, for the sake of legal fees, would actually tie somebody up in a settlement agreement. It's quite prudent. My only final point I had really is there is no right to be accompanied in the protected conversation, so you don't need to, you can be really quite informal or quite private conversations. Along with what Katie was saying, is choose your situation very carefully, choose your environment very carefully, because it is going to be a difficult conversation, because it's one that will come out of the blue. Have a script. It's often good to have the piece of paper there, have the letter that confirms it. This is a protected conversation. So actually you're almost giving them a letter at the end of the meeting. Quite good to think, look, just go home now. You don't need to go back to your desk at the moment. Just go home, think about it, think about what we've said. If you're looking at it on a Thursday, have the weekend to consider, come back to us on Monday. So just thinking about how you buy yourself some time with that. Just as a final little poll, we just wondered whether how many protected conversations people had actually been involved in, and whether it's something you're quite familiar with. We talk about them an awful lot, and it can be on either side. You may have had one on both sides if you want to. For mine, I have never had one. I've drafted a few letters for people to do, but I've never actually had to do one myself. So. Yeah, lots of us haven't. Yeah, okay. So more people haven't. They are often seen as, while definitely a difficult conversation, they are often seen as the kinder way, but it's going to be more difficult at the outset. So anyway, that's my bit done. Hopefully that was helpful. I'm going to pass you back to Nikki now, who's going to close off. Thanks very much.
Brilliant. Thanks ever so much, Becky, and thanks ever so much, Katie. Hopefully everybody's found that quite interesting. And as I say, I suspect some of you might be able to relate to maybe some of the information that's been given today. Yeah, in respect to what Becky just said, obviously in respect to notice, I tend to agree. If you're getting rid of somebody, then you may not want them to work their notice period. Of course, you're entitled to be paid for it. The only thing that I say is just be a little bit careful, because depending on the length of service, you don't want them, if you haven't followed a proper process, let's say, or indeed any process, then just be careful, because you don't want them to flip over into the 2 years and you haven't followed any process and obviously got rid of them, therefore unfairly. Yeah, I don't know if anyone's got any questions. Nothing's come through on the chat to me, but I know sometimes they go to other people directly. But I don't know if anybody's got anything which they want to contribute or raise, or any experiences themselves which they'd like to share. Obviously, as confidentially as you can, but aware that this is a public forum, if you like, and is being recorded. No? Okay. Well, as I say, I certainly can relate myself, having had to have conversations with more junior members of staff in respect to certain things, some being performance and some being personal. And although I'm an employment lawyer and I advise daily on these sorts of things, as an individual, I can admit that I find it very uncomfortable as well. But these conversations need to be had, because, as I say, they really don't improve. So,
yeah. Sorry, just thinking, if I just add one thing, because we've got a minute or two, for people who are actually having those conversations, when you want to start the dialogue around how to start the conversation, it can be really tempting to start with why questions. Why did you do that? Why are you behaving this way? And if we think about one of the barriers being how will people react, why questions are really, they can be quite incendiary. They can get people on the defensive. So sometimes it's also worth thinking more around what and how questions instead of why questions. So what are the barriers to you doing what we need you to do, or how have you been feeling? How is this affecting your performance? So try and stay away from the whys and go down the whats and the hows if possible, because you're likely to get a better result.
Yeah, no, thanks for that, Kate. I think you're absolutely right. And I think it's also worth noting that in my experience, line managers sometimes don't deal with these issues, because they want to get on with sort of managing the team and their KPIs and operations, all that sort of stuff, which is great. But I think they also need a little bit of support. So I do think HR are quite important in trying to explain why it is that these issues need to be addressed, and giving them the support and the confidence, if I'm blunt about it, to be able to have the tools to go ahead and deal with these sorts of issues. So I do think training and support in the background is really essential. And perhaps in the lead up to, not waiting for an issue to arise and for an issue to have been boiling away for the last 5 years. But anyway, so on that note, can I just thank everybody for attending today? We are going to have a poll that's going to come up hopefully shortly. I don't know whether Zoe will pop it onto the screens while I just finish chatting. So thank you everyone for attending. Thank you, Becky, and thank you, Katie, for your contributions. I found it really interesting. I think it's such a topical point, and it's a point that nobody wants to address, invariably. Thank you also to the Chamber for assisting us in organising the event. And to help us, our next event is going to be on I'm just going to grab my diary here, on the 7th of October will be the next HR Bite-Size event. So hopefully you can join us then, to help us to prep and actually provide a topic that everybody's interested in. We've got some ideas which hopefully are on the screen in front of you. So if you can click on the ones or the one, I'm not sure, I think it's multiple choice, yep. that you would like to hear about, we will then try and make sure that we cover topics that are actually of interest. If there's anything else that is particularly topical to you, just drop one of us an email and we'll be very happy to try and weave that into the session as well. So I think on that note, unless if I've missed anything, thank you all again very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, bye.
Thank you.